Okay, welcome to the final meeting of this academic year. The academic year is really over, kind of, but this is our last meeting of the Socratic Club for the year. We're glad you're here. I'm excited, already looking ahead to next year. Next year is the 10th anniversary of the Gonzaga Socratic Club. We've been doing this now for 9 years, finishing up 9th year today. So that's a nice landmark. And we're going to have some great things coming up next year, so stay tuned. If you aren't on our email info list, there's a sign up there. Please let us know how to get in contact with you. Or you can check the website, just look up Gonzaga Socratic Club, and amazingly enough, it'll pop up with Google. So we follow the example of the Oxford Socratic Club, which was founded in the mid-1900s at Oxford University. It was presided over by famous Christian apologist C.S. Lewis, but Lewis didn't start the club, other people did, and there was an interest in, there are all kinds of clubs and extracurricular, co-curricular groups and activities at Oxford University, but there was a sense that theists weren't talking to non-theists very much, and weren't talking about sort of critical foundational questions, and that's what motivated the founding of the Oxford Socratic Club. And the Socratic part, you might wonder, if you've been here before, you've heard my spiel, but the Socratic part might be a little confusing. Socrates? I thought it was about Christianity. Why is it the Oxford Jesus Club or something like that? Well, the club took as its motto the Socratic dictum to follow the argument wherever it leads. As you can see, would be appropriate for an organization that's meant to examine foundational questions about theism. And so the Gonzaga Socratic Club takes its inspiration from the Oxford Club. And today we're going to address one of those topics that I think is right at the heart of what the Socratic Club does. We're looking at the relationship between doubt and faith. And I'm very fortunate that my philosophy colleague Erik Schmidt, Dr. Erik Schmidt, taught a course this semester on faith and doubt, so he is brimming with ideas, and he's going to engage in a project of, we might say, rehabilitating the role that doubt plays in a vibrant faith life. And as we were talking about this, I couldn't help but think of doubt, faith. It reminded me of that famous skeptic critic of theism, Richard Dawkins, who famously defines faith in a way that most Christians and theists more broadly would say isn't really faith, it's fideism. He defines faith as, well actually he says, and he says this more than once, I just picked an essay by him that he gave, a talk that he gave at the 1996 Humanist of the Year award honor. So he said, faith being belief that isn't based on evidence, there's the definition, right? Faith is belief not based on evidence, is the principal vice of any religion. And in contrasting faith and science, or religion and science, he says, he's addressing the question, is science a religion? Is it a faith? Does it involve a faith commitment? And he says, well, science is not religion, and it doesn't just come down to faith. Although it has many of religion's virtues, it has none of its vices. So science has none of the vices of religion. Science is based upon verifiable evidence. Religious faith not only lacks evidence, that's fideism, right? Faith is belief without evidence. So religious faith not only lacks evidence, its independence from evidence is its pride and joy, shouted from the rooftops. Hooray! We have no evidence! Right? Why else would Christians wax critical of doubting Thomas? The other apostles are held up to us as exemplars of virtue because faith was enough for them. Doubting Thomas, on the other hand, required evidence. Perhaps he should be the patron saint of scientists, end quote. So what Dr. Schmidt is going to do for us today is, I might say, not only rehabilitate doubt, but he's going to rehabilitate and rescue the Apostle Thomas from the clutches of Richard Dawkins. So, with that, I invite my colleague, let's welcome Erik Schmidt up here to speak.
Thank you, David, for that wonderful introduction. It's a really great opportunity to be able to have this forum, to be able to discuss issues and ideas from multiple perspectives. And as David mentioned, I did a special topics course this year that I'm going to do again and hopefully get into the regular catalog on doubt. And I had a number of different reasons for wanting to do that. Partly, I wanted a course that would counterbalance other faith and reason issues that we have already in the catalog. And partly, I wanted it to be a context in which students could explore questions of faith and reason from a variety of perspectives, whether those perspectives be atheist, whether those perspectives be agnostic, or whether those perspectives be theistic. So what I'm going to do here is not try to pack a full semester into one talk, but rather, since it is the Socratic Club, I thought what I would address is the question of what does doubt contribute to the life of a person of faith, is the perspective that I'm going to take. So in some ways, Dawkins will here be kind of left off to the side.
Fair enough.
Fair enough. So really to start with is just kind of this idea about what it is, what doubt is. And so doubt is nothing more than the recognition, in my view, of both the partiality, in other words, the limitations of our perspective, and the limits of human understanding, which lead to the incredible possibility that we may be wrong. So it is an admission of partiality and the limitations of human understanding, which lead us to the conclusion that we might be wrong about something. So I'd like to spend at least a little bit of time. I had students read a book by a cognitive psychologist on questions about being wrong, and just simply point out, what does it feel like to be wrong? And there's a little bit of peculiarity here. I think, let me just see here. Yeah, there it is, doubting. What does it feel like to be wrong? Well, it feels like being right. Right? I mean, there's no sense in which you can end up saying, this is a belief I have and I'm wrong. To believe something is to take it to be true. And that means that it's impossible for being wrong to exist in the first person present tense. Simply not possible. It's literally impossible for us to feel wrong. Now, we might accept fallibility, and we often all say, oh, we're so fallible, but yet we're always startled by our mistakes. So you might say, just kind of start with that kind of just recognition. Just realize, it's kind of the starting point from a psychological perspective of doubt is to recognize both the tendency to error and also our error blindness. The second kind of claim I just want to make, and this is something that cognitive psychologists point out, is that when we discover that we're wrong, the false belief is almost immediately replaced with a new belief. And so there's also, it's just such a short period of time that we almost radically underestimate by memory, by recall, how frequently we've been wrong in the past. Usually, if we remember being wrong, it's something that is usually a trivial belief, and it's usually a belief about which we feel a tremendous amount of embarrassment. So it's kind of an interesting thing, kind of just starting from the recognition that doubt is positive in part because it reinforces and calls to mind an attention to our inherent fallibility. Second, that I just simply want to point out is looking at the ancient word for skepticism. The word skepsis, most directly in terms of translation, would be inquiry. We almost always think of skeptics as the person in the back of the class, the person who's kind of taking, just kind of cutting other people down to size. But it really is, from its origin, a call to inquiry. And this really is, in the history of the Socratic tradition, Socrates' primary point of the relationship between skepticism and philosophy. So I want to kind of emphasize these kind of two dual parts. It's an attention to our fallibility, and it's also a call to inquiry. All right, so what I'd like to do next, in some ways to kind of keep this, keep the topic of doubt here manageable, I thought about titling the talk, Can a Christian be an agnostic? And what I'd like to do is kind of think about doubt here, in particular from the perspective of agnosticism. So the term agnosticism, a little bit of history is kind of interesting, just because it gives us two senses of the term agnostic. So the term comes from Huxley, actually, and he was in the Bloomberg group at the time, and he was trying to come up with a term that would help him to identify his faith commitment. And he first came up with this notion of what we might call the agnostotheo, and he said in reference to the altar to the unknown God, he said, that's my God, the God which cannot be known. And so this, you might say, is what I would call a form of substantive agnosticism. It's an agnosticism which shares a great deal with apophatic theology. It shares a great deal in common with mysticism. The idea here is that there is a God, but this God is by God's nature unknowable to us. Later on, Huxley, later on in life, did that not? I muted PowerPoint. Oh, maybe I didn't copy the next slide. Oh, wait. Okay, it just not come out. Oh, well. Yeah, we'll just kind of give the non-Gnostic. The second version that he wanted to give was this idea that he thought that his alternative wasn't the unknown God, but it was an anti-Gnosticism. Where Gnosticism here is the, traditionally, historically, the ancient Greek, kind of originating in ancient Greece, this idea that the God worshipped by Christians is actually a false god. It is actually a demiurge, which is part of the material universe rather than a part of the broader spiritual reality of which the world is a part. And the Gnostics emphasized the special knowledge that they had of the background spiritual reality of which the Christian church was just simply a misleading false, pursuit of a false god. And so here, what we get is not a substantive agnosticism, but what I like to call sort of a meta-agnosticism. It's a claim. It's a claim here that it's a claim not about God's unknowability, but rather a claim about there is no special knowledge when it comes to God. It's an anti-Gnosticism. So what I actually want to do today is kind of think, what does the anti-Gnostic or meta-agnostic perspective have to show a person of faith about the value of doubt? That's kind of the grand sort of question. So we'll start here with kind of a classic thing here, which is, when we think about the history of doubt, the first thing I want to point out is that the history of doubt is that it's very easy to find scriptural passages in which doubt seems to be denigrated. Doubt seems to be the opposite of faith. So we get first famous passage in which Peter hops out of the boat to walk on the water with Jesus, and he cries out, "Lord, save me," and Jesus says to him, "You have little faith, why did you doubt?" He doubts and simply sinks into the water. So it seems like this really sort of incredibly heavy-laden image, a metaphor for what doubt is. Doubt is literally sinking away from the miraculous hand of God. And that seems to set us up for thinking that doubt or agnosticism would be bad for faith. Second would be sort of the mustard seed analogy. The disciples come back after failing to be able to heal, to be able to cast out a demon. The disciples came to Jesus and said, "Why could we not cast it out?" He said to them, "Because of your little faith. For truly I tell you, if you have faith the size of a mustard seed, you will say this to this mountain, move from here to there, and it will move, and nothing will be impossible for you." Right? This kind of, once again, this notion that doubt places us away from the full potential and power of God's miraculous love. So another, doubting Thomas. I don't know, so you might say here, yeah, my hope here is to kind of rescue Thomas, kind of a very famous scene in which Jesus says to him, have you believed because you have seen me? Well, blessed are those who have not seen me and yet have come to believe. Once again, this kind of notion of doubting Thomas as kind of an emblem of the dangers of doubt. And then also, I've had friends point this out as a passage in Revelation in which they think is directly targeted toward agnostics. This idea that somehow an agnostic is just kind of a fence sitter. You know, I'm not really going to go one way, I'm not really going to go the other way, that they're roughly indifferent in some sense. And so they often pull out this passage, I know your works, you are neither hot nor cold. This is, you know, the apocalyptic Jesus speaking. I wish that you were either hot or cold or hot, because you are lukewarm and neither hot or cold or hot. I'm about to spit you out of my mouth, for you say I am rich, and kind of going on. The passage isn't really about belief. The passage is really a response to the church in Arabia. I don't know, how do you pronounce it?
I think this is Laodicea.
Oh, Laodicea, it's Laodicea, excellent, yeah. So it's the church of Laodicea, which is more about the kind of indifference to the gospel call than it really is about belief. But so often, you know, it's often that I've heard friends tell me, well, this is really, you know, this is agnosticism. You don't want Jesus to spew you out of his mouth. So, it should not be good. And then finally we get the really big claim here, right, that the law was replaced by faith. I mean, Romans, as you know, as the letter to the Romans is just filled with this language. What are we to say then, Gentiles, who did not strive for righteousness, have attained it? That is, righteousness through faith. But Israel, who did strive for the righteousness that is based on the law, did not succeed in fulfilling that law. Why not? Because they did not strive for it on the basis of faith, but as if it were based on works. And this is a classic text Protestants use for, you know, and obviously, you know, I don't need to get into the specific passage as much as just to say, this is a passage that's often used about agnosticism. Once again, the idea here is it's really our belief and our faith that is really the fundamental connection that we have through the covenant to God now, rather than the Levitical law. So it looks bad for faith, right? I mean, excuse me, it looks bad for doubt, right? It looks like you know, it looks like the agnostic, the meta-level agnostic may have nothing to show in person of faith. Not only from sort of Dawkins' perspective, you might say, more importantly, from a scriptural perspective. We really, I think we ought to take quite seriously what seems to be a message about the threat of doubt. And I do not take that, I don't take that threat lightly, and it's something to which I really think that as a philosopher, thinking more carefully about epistemic notions like doubt, I have to take quite seriously. So let's move to, just trying to remember here. We'll get to that in a second, actually. All right. So, did I not put in the symmetry argument?
It's back a couple.
Did I?
It's back a few.
It's way back. Was it before all this?
Yeah.
Ha! That's awesome. There we go. So let's take a look at the argument that most agnostics, some form of the symmetry argument seems to be the argument that most agnostics will put forward. So it's a pretty straightforward argument. Three general premises with one conclusion. You can get variations on it. But the idea is that the first claim is an argument of incompatibility. So the basic claim is that the central themes, the central claims, central doctrines in the world's major religious conditions major religions are inconsistent with each other. So that's kind of statement number one. That there are fundamental incompatibilities between the claims of revelation found in the major religions of the world, both the major, the three major monotheistic religions, and spread more widely across the globe. Second, each major religion has roughly equivalent overall epistemic merits, and this is an argument that people want to argue from the perspective of textual criticism. They want to argue this from the perspective of increased understanding of the anthropological understanding of the cultural origins of religion. They argue this from a wide number of perspectives, just to say, look, it seems like there's really no, and sometimes it's a more philosophical argument where the claim to the epistemic merits are often based upon religious experience or special revelation, but obviously these are things which are inherently unconfirmable. And so the argument is, there's a rough parity, there's rough symmetry between the epistemic position that each major religion's in. Sometimes it gets coupled together with a kind of an individualized version of number three, which is adherents of each religion seem to come to believe in the truth of their claims through a similar process, psychological, developmental, cultural, and so on. And so the argument is not only are the individual religions incompatible and on a rough similar epistemic footing, but individual believers are on a similar epistemic footing as well. And so this draws a conclusion. And notice it's going to be a conclusion that is itself unconditional. If God exists, we must conclude that God is something we know not what. I mean, at best, we're going to have to be substantive agnostics. And possibly, we should draw the conclusion that we also ought to be, and it's a conditional, so who knows whether the antecedent term gets satisfied, whether there is or not. So that's the standard, you might say, argument for agnosticism that gets, trotted out in the literature. What I want to do is, and we can come back to the symmetry argument, I'm more than happy to do that, but what I want to do, just given the time constraints, is ask the following question. What if we think this argument has some strength to it? Notice that the premises are evidential claims. They're claims about the similar status of this, scriptural accuracy in the different faiths. What might a person of faith gain by saying that they're roughly agnostic about the symmetry argument? In other words, if they roughly say to themselves, I don't really know how to assess the strength of these different. I have reasons for committing myself to my faith, but I don't know exactly how I respond to, in particular, 2 and 3. Okay, so that's going to be the exercise. I'm more than happy to come back to the argument itself to see kind of where you might think the argument is potentially the weakest. Okay, so now I can step through the Gospels. All right. And so now I'd like to turn to the question about the implications for the person of faith. First thing I want to mention, before we'll get to this in a second with Aquinas and Augustine, but the first thing I want to mention is not all the major monotheistic religions have the same relationship to agnosticism. In particular, I'll single out here, the Jewish faith has a particular tradition of accepting within its fold not only rabbinical teachings from individuals who are themselves agnostic, but also active participants who are agnostic. I have several relatives who go to synagogue each week. They're quite devout in the sense of their practices and in terms of the practices of Judaism. And yet, if you talk to them, they'll say, no, I'm perfectly agnostic about the question of God's existence. I think my rabbi is as well. It's really kind of a strong tradition. Now, finding out a little bit more about what that tradition is, you can go back historically to Mendelssohn in the 16th century. You can go back to Spinoza. I mean, I had my class look a little bit at this Jewish tradition of agnostic faith to kind of, to take a look at it. I also think that there are kind of 2 main reasons why currently I think it is a strong tradition. I think first is the Holocaust. And talking to several relatives, I think the fact that it didn't matter whether or not you were a believer or not, if you were going to be taken to the extermination camps, played some role. They feel if we're going to be grouped together, then we will be together. And so I think that was one element. I think a second element really does come off of this notion that substantive agnosticism has always been an important part of the Jewish faith. Obviously, the term Jehovah is a term that can't even be spoken. And so they're much more comfortable, I think, with substantive agnosticism than we are in the mainline theist tradition today, although there are many theists that I talk to that seem to be closer to substantive agnosticism than I initially might have suspected. So that's kind of the first thing I just want to point out is that there are traditions here. We might think here that agnosticism is completely at odds, but there has been, particularly in the Jewish tradition, an acceptance. But what about us? You might say theists here maybe potentially committed to the Catholic tradition. I want to think here about first. We might say what might faith look like if we were to be sort of persuaded, even partially, by the symmetry argument? I think the first question is, I think it tends to emphasize Kierkegaard's notion of faith as a leap and as a commitment. We've tended to, there's a tendency to push toward a notion of faith which places a more explicit connection or explicit weight on epistemic claims about evidence rather than questions about commitment. And I think to draw an analogy here, a very simple analogy, glad Laura's not here, my wife, which is I am no less committed to my wife Laura for recognizing that there are many other women I could have married, and I would have also potentially had a happy life. I mean, that's an unromantic thought. I'm not going to write it on Valentine's Day card, but, I mean, I remember shortly after asking Laura to marry me, I pointed out to her that this is, an absolute commitment based upon finite information. So clearly this is, but none of these things all sounded very unromantic to her. But for me, you might say, no, you misunderstand marital love if you take seriously, you're the best for me. I mean, sure, that looks great on a Hallmark card, but I think there's something missing about the nature of the commitment that is marriage. And I think there's no reason why we can't, I mean, I'm just proposing, or you might think, speaking here on behalf of, you might say, the symmetry argument theist, maybe we should think of our faith in those terms. That Catholicism, maybe the symmetry argument's right. We have no reason for thinking that if I had been born in Iran, I'd have a different faith life than I do. But maybe my commitment to, or maybe one's commitment to their version of theism is similar to a marriage. So I just put that out there as a suggestion. I think that brings out what you might call the Kierkegaardian dimensions of faith. And so I think doubt in some ways opens up a faith which is more than simply belief. So the second thing that I would point out is that a faith can be understood as a story of conversion, an ongoing story of conversion. I mean, the nature of apologetics changed from the early Roman church into Augustine in terms of who their audience was and who they were attempting, what they were attempting to reveal. And I think that's another line that we looked at in the class was this notion of apologetics and notion of confession. And so I think doubt also plays a critical role in our notion of the ongoing role of conversion to faith. That faith, like a marriage, is not a process that ends at some point. You don't hit the marker where you say, now it's done. So I think it helps to remind us that doubt is behind every story of conversion, and the story of conversion is the story of our faith. And then the second thing that I point out in these lines is that faith is in part a longing for God. And if faith is a longing for God, it's not clear to me that you can desire what you already have. And so if it's not possible to long for what you already have, I think doubt reinforces the fact that not only is faith life here on earth a matter of conversion, but it's a matter of longing. And I think as a matter of longing, it has an inherent acceptance of, you might say partial fear of, the symmetry argument. Because the symmetry argument should matter to us in a sense. I mean, being in that epistemic position should matter to us. And so then finally, kind of fourth, I point out, this is kind of just broadly in terms of how doubt transforms faith. Think about the following list of terms, and think about how they all grow out of the absence of security and the absence of certainty. And I think all of these things are present as part of faith. I think first, the word trust. I think second, the word obedience. If you have a full knowledge of precisely what you're doing and why you're doing, it's no longer obedience in a sense. So I just think about the role of obedience. I think hope, mystery, empathy, humility. I mean, think of all these sorts of words that we identify with our faith. Almost all of them, I would argue, have some element of doubt within them, some element of recognition of the symmetry. All right, so to kind of reinforce that, I'll point out that faith is a feature of to question, to doubt, to recognize our fallibility, to recognize the inevitability and our blindness to being wrong. first runs counter to our future interests often within a group, but it is a bold proclamation of our individual freedom relative to it. And I think that's one reason why doubt is a fearful thing in some ways when it comes to community. I think it's powerful in a lot of ways. I think to doubt in this sense is to value truth more than it is to value loyalty. But I think that's on the divided side as an individual. I think for the group, there's one, the humble, charitable recognition that we're all in the epistemic game together. We're all in a faith that is a kind of marriage. I think so that's one which I think helps build up the community. And I think second, it pays a loyalty to truth over the community itself. It's the truth which binds the community together and provides what's transformative and orienting for the group. And so, in a sense, there is no community, I think, without a dedication to truth. And doubt just simply is to pay loyalty to the truth in a way that recognizes our common standing to the truth. And I think that is I think that's an important way to think about the community of faith. I think doubt transforms the way we think about the community. Then second, justice. I think without meaningful questioning, it's very difficult to challenge society. I think if there's one lesson that we take, one lesson we can take from the Second World War, or from the last century in general, is the danger of not questioning, of not doubting. I think that's just absolutely clear at a social level. And it's absolutely clear that sometimes you just got to man the guns. I mean, to use a metaphor. Sometimes, there's a point at which you don't want to be the person, in the barracks kind of going, well, what really is a doctrine of double effect? What really is a just war? However, you might say, I could have a lot more trust in the military that is coming out of a culture, a society, or a community in which doubting is encouraged. I think it does. I think it can increase our trust in formidable use of force, as an example. Another way of to create an alternative future, we cannot recreate the thinking that has shaped our past, and yet if we do not challenge the forces that shape who we are or what we do, we won't change. So you might say, I think justice is, in many ways, if we think about the call to faith as a call to justice, especially thinking about faith as a marriage to God here on earth, I think if it's a call to justice, it's deeply wedded to this notion of questioning. And then finally, compassion. I think this notion of compassion has kind of two sides. On the one side, it's very easy to say, well, I doubt, and therefore I recognize my fallibility, and that puts me into compassionate empathy with my fellows. I think also to doubt is to recognize that compassion is coordinated with respect. I think it's easy for compassion, when it comes to views, to simply shift into indifference about the other person. And I think a compassion that takes quite seriously the views of the other person is a compassion which will encourage us to doubt another person's views. It is to respect and to take them seriously. And I think compassion so in other words, I think that doubt helps to round out the recognition of the role that humility plays in compassion, to recognize that compassion is a combination of humility and respect. So then let's move next to redemption. Another thing that I think often gets left out of thoughts about faith, and a lot of people, especially the Dawkins and the new atheists, like to discuss the role that faith plays in giving people comfort, the role that faith plays in giving people hope. I think this notion of redemption is a notion that's very difficult, that's absolutely central to faith and what the process of faith is. And I think it's not really faith without a notion of redemption. And I think doubt plays a role in redemption. So I'll give you my first stab at this, which is doubt in prayer. And this comes out of, in particular, you might say petitionary prayer. And this is another topic that I could get into during the question and answer, I suppose. But there is something that I sometimes like to call the repugnant implication of petitionary prayer. If petitionary prayer is conceived of as a transaction, if petitionary prayer is conceived of as a request that God might in His grace meet, which is that then when you praise God for answering the prayer, the repugnant implication is the implication to all other people who have not received, a similar answer or made, and obviously there are theodicies and there are all sorts of ways that we can understand that. But I've always had a very difficult and personally troubling time thinking carefully and clearly about petitionary prayer. And I think doubt in some ways can transform petitionary prayer and in some ways redeem petitionary prayer from the repugnant implication, because rather than a transaction, prayer on behalf of, we have a good friend of ours, going through breast cancer right now, and I think, the prayer there is not a transactional prayer. It's a prayer, a statement of helplessness in a sense. I mean, I think it's the prayer of petition. It's not a prayer of petition as much as it is a prayer of help. And I think to cry out help is a way of thinking about interceding on other people's behalf in a way that's informed by the symmetry argument. Because what isn't going to garner on one side as part of the praise and answer to that prayer, God having done something on my behalf. That's going to require me to make a whole bunch of claims that have been, in a sense, knocked out by the symmetry argument. And so I think petition gets transformed into in my view, redeemed into an understanding of praying to other people, praying to God for other people out of a sense of hopelessness. All right, speed up here. The next thing I would say is a big part of redemption is unselfing, to borrow a term here from Iris Murdoch. This notion that it's a turning away from the solipsistic focus that we have on ourselves. And I think, first of all, doubt is itself to take the world seriously. And here I think Dawkins is quite right, that as people of faith we need to take scientists, really as a kind of a model of faith. A scientist can work their entire life. Think of Priestley fighting for a phlogiston against Lavoisier's oxygenation theory, right? I mean, he goes, you can go through your whole life dedicated to a theory, and you're ready for the world to prove you wrong. I sat at a table at the lunch today with a bunch of scientists and just asked them, what about doubt in chemistry? And chemistry is largely the department that was there. And they said, oh, well, that's science. Science is doubt. And then one person said, science is a controversy conducted at the edge of ignorance. And I thought, that's about right. And then someone else said, well, if I describe my work, I'd say my work as a scientist is looking in a darkened room for a black cat that might not be there. And I thought, there's a sense in which, so I think science, it has to do with this way in which it's an act of unselfing, to turn yourself over to the world, and the act of doubt is the act to recognize that you're turning yourself toward the world and creation. I think the second thing to this is that notion of inquiry from skepticism, that doubt and unselfing is inevitably a turn toward inquiry. It's not a turn toward quietism, it's not a turn toward passivity, it's a turn outward toward the world. And then finally I point out that doubt renews creativity. I think part of redemption is for our capacity to engage in the creative arts, something that I brought up to my two other lectures or talks for the Socratic Club about art. And then finally, I'd say is that redemption is demanding of us, and doubt is ultimately demanding. I think it fights ultimately against our natural tendency toward indifference. And so with that, I will end, and I will turn things over to Mike, who will talk to us about Gerard Manley Hopkins, a very important Jesuit poet, who used poetry to explore the inevitability of doubt as mankind.
I greatly underestimated the number of people who show up on the last day of the semester on Friday. So I'm going to, and in fact, I'd like to send these back. I don't have enough for everybody for the back row, and I'll put this on the board, the poem on the, or on the screen there, so the folks closer up can see it. This is Gerard Manley Hopkins' poem, God's Grandeur, which is not a poem in which the poet doubts. In fact, it's very clear that he has faith in it. But the poem asks the question, why do people doubt? And answers that question.
While Mike's pulling that up, Dr. Pringle was not given a proper introduction. I was going to say a word. Dr. Mike Pringle is in the English department, and he and Dr. Schmidt do a number of research projects together, especially concerning Shakespeare. So it's nice to have you here to shed further light on this question about doubt and faith.
This is the sonnet, 14 lines. You probably immediately, I hope, recognize it's a sonnet. Some of you might notice that it's an Italian sonnet. You remember that? The first 4 lines spell out the name of a Scandinavian pop group. You've got an Italian sonnet, ABBA. And the first 4 lines, oftentimes in an Italian sonnet, we'll take a look at it, will be the octet, we'll call it, and then the sestet. And in between there is that pause or volta. This one, I believe, works with 2 quatrains, and then the sestet. The name is CD, CD, CD. Not in the rhyme scheme here. In that opening 4 lines, the world is charged with the grandeur of God. It will flame out like shining from shook foil. It gathers to a greatness like the ooze of oil, crushed. Why do men then now not reckon God? So the opening lines there give us 2 very dissimilar similes. It will flame out. The world is charged, electrically charged, and it will flash forth, instantaneous, right off the bat, fast and over with. Just a hint, a flash, an illumination. And the second simile there, like the ooze of oil, crushed. And that one I think we're seeing like olive oil, imagine it underneath the wheel of an old stone press, slowly oozing out the oil, slowly gathering, slowly going into the bucket and being collected. It's really kind of hard to imagine 2 more dissimilar tropes. And yet, the implication there is if we look closely enough at either one of those, we look deeply enough at either one of those, we're going to find hints of glory, hints of that design, hints of that, what he called inscape. I'll come back to that term in a second here. The second quatrain of the octet here is, so he's asked a question at the end of the first year. If it's there, if the evidence is there and can be read and seen, why then do men not believe? Why then do people not? And Rod here, I think, is referring, of course, to, most often I see it referenced in Exodus, but the power of God, and in that case, the power of God to spite. And why do they not fear it? Why do they not reckon on it? Generations have trod, and all is seared with trade, bleared, smeared with toil, and wears man's smudge and shares man's smell. The soil is bare now, nor can foot feel being shod. And so there's a shift there in that first quatrain, I believe, is the evidence. It's there. We can, if you look closely enough, carefully enough, you see it. It's around us. We can find it. Why then don't people believe? And the answer seems to be that we're weary. Trod, have trod, have trod. The verse itself shows the weariness. You can feel it just in saying it aloud. Seared with trade, bleared, smeared, smudged, and smelly. The world is dry and hot and dirty and smelly. And we're alienated from it. That it's smudged, besmirched, stained by us. And I think in that second quatrain, we see some biblical implications about the fall, an alienation from a perfect nature of being in communion with nature, being a part of it, and now being alienated from that. Also the notion of earning your bread by the sweat of your face and toil. And that has a dulling, alienating effect on us. And it wears us down, and it wears us out, and we can't see the beauty anymore. We can't see that inscape. What he sees is that essential something about the very nature of identity of something. How that adheres in every single thing. He makes the verb sells. It sells and separates itself and makes itself known to us. And we miss it. Too often we don't see it. And so the turn here into the sestet, before I go there, I should say that was sort of the biblical allusions that I think are being made there. I think overlaid on that is, as an English prof, might go to a more cultural and historical framework here too. He's writing this one probably in the late 1870s, early 1880s. We don't have exact dates on some of these poems. It's time of, he's in England, sometimes in Ireland. He's moved around a bit. But it's a time of urbanization, industrialization. It's a time of moving towards cities away from farms. There's real problems developing from that. And some of that is a kind of alienation that's visible in large populations of cities and such. And so I think also he's in, and I see him as linked more with the Romantics. How come sometimes, because he's such a stylist, he's got such a unique voice and he's got such an original voice, he often gets taken up by the modernists as a proto-modernist. And I don't think he is. I think in many ways he's more in alignment with the Romantics, and I think really strongly with American Romanticism as well. And so in the term there, in the volta, into the sestet, and for all this, nature is never spent. And nobody uses the term spent there as tying up that notion of trade and such. It's not. It's never bankrupt. It's never broke. But it's also never extinguished. It's never out of what charges it. That charge is always there. For all this, nature is never spent. There lives the dearest freshness. I'll point out again that term dearest here. We don't use it this way anymore, but it's also to be dearest, to be expensive, to be very costly. The dearest freshness, deep down things. And though the last lights off the black west went, oh morning at the brown brink eastward springs, because the Holy Ghost over the bent world broods with warm breast and with bright wings. Not too surprisingly, he's using light and dark here. By the way, I said this isn't a poem that expresses his doubt. If you want a poem that expresses his doubt, there are several of them out there, but I think one of the most powerful is Harriet Comfort, which is really a struggle with his own personal doubts. It's very dark, I'll warn you in advance here. I didn't want to do it on a spring night. And he's got a series of what were later dubbed the terrible sonnets of his sort of dark nights of the soul. And I've got a list of those if anybody's really interested in doing some of this. But here, yeah, the light goes out, it gets dark, and the sun does set. But we can trust that it will rise. And I love the imagery of the morning at the brown brink eastward springs, because the Holy Ghost over the bent, and he's got us still bowed down, still kind of bent over with toil and weariness and sort of being just simply worn out, with a warm breast and all bright wings. And I think broods there, everybody used to know brood meant to sit on a nest. And not a lot of people keep chickens anymore, not everybody all knows that. Of course, we use it today as a psychological term, and I think it means both here. That there's a God out there who's contemplating this, who's paying attention, but also warning us and preparing us for a rise. In this case, I think that final image there is one of renewal, of rebirth, or a birth, and of course those wings, and it's a visual image of the sun rising up and that flare of light over the earth after darkness. And so it's emergent, in poetry here, which is what Hopkins felt poetry could do and a poet could do, was help people to see that inscape, that essential nature, intrinsic individual nature of something, and help show it, and help other people to see it. And so the evidence that slips by us, if you're looking for evidence, I think you might suggest you can help people to see it and bring them to this more enthusiastic and faithful conclusion. He's got some poems, I will say, in the Carrying Comfort form that don't end quite so brightly. And those are a little darker. Thank you.
So, questions or thoughts or things you want to discuss with either of us is fine. Yeah.
I'll ask a question.
Done.
Oftentimes when I encounter people who are interested in the symmetry argument, as you call it, their conclusion isn't one of anything but indifference. They move from there to indifference to checking out. Somehow the fact of different claims makes them conclude they're all false rather than being interested in investigating which one, if any, might be true or some other one. And you were saying, you started to say some things at the end about indifference, and then as you were finishing out, I just thought maybe you had more to say about that.
More to say about indifference. Yeah, I think in many ways people associate doubt with indifference. Doubt is a kind of shrugging of the shoulders. It's, well, both sides are, look like they're equally wrong or equally right, or, somewhere in the difference. So, let's just not answer the question. I think if you take the second and third premises as clear expressions of both the inevitability of being wrong, right, on the one hand, and sort of our blind sight, as it were, our error blindness. I think then you can see why the symmetry argument ought to push us toward investigation and inquiry more than sort of an indifference, because we should be worried about our error blindness. We should be worried about our capacity to be wrong. We should be worried about the fact, right? So I think one way of looking at it would be how you read the second and third premise. I think another way of looking at it is, and this may not be as friendly of an answer in some sense, but I think, going back to the idea that this transforms, it's transformative of the kind of faith of which these beliefs are constitutive, right? I mean, it is part of my argument, is that the symmetry argument shows us something about the epistemic status of the beliefs we have, which are part of what it means to have faith. But faith is more, in a sense, than just belief. And so I do think there's a sense in which we might think to continue to draw on the analogy of marriage. I can imagine someone saying the same thing about marriage. There are just so many people out there. How will I ever pick one? Right? And you want to say that there's a problem there, right? I mean, you'd worry about a friend who found themselves in that position. But I don't know that your answer to them would be an answer that's necessarily straightforwardly epistemic. I think it'd be a question about the grounds of choice and commitment. So I don't know. I mean, so I guess I'd say if there is indifference that comes off of the symmetry argument, it's not clear to me that it's a product of the argument, as much as the argument becomes an expression for other things that are going on for that person. Does that, so that kind of would take that twofold way. Because it's not clear that you can argue somebody into a commitment. What? Unless there's money. Well, then you're luring them, right? You can lure people into a commitment. Yeah, clearly. So I don't know if that helps, but I think that's right. I mean, I think, you know, and it's similar to the first premise, right? I mean, the first premise, which is about the distinctness of religious claims. That's another one that a lot of people think, oh gosh, you know, we fought so many wars over that first premise. Let's just throw out that first premise. I think that's also kind of a mistake. I think it's a failure of respect. I think it's a failure of humility. I think it's a, you know, it's also problematic. So maybe in some ways a symmetry argument might be diagnostic by other things, but what else should we expect? I mean, faith is such a personal, cultural, communal heritage of sorts. So I mean, it makes sense to me that these issues are going to be blended in existential terms.
Eric, on that note, it seems to me your marriage analogy nicely sets up a point here that, especially this observation that there are any number of people that you could have married, right? It seems like that can lead in one of two directions. I think it's interesting that you brought up this kind of idea of an existential commitment here, because it could either bring you in the direction of, in wonder, exploring the depth of meaning that exists in your relationship with your spouse, or it can kind of be the basis of a weary resignation that you essentially could think of yourself as having made the wrong choice, right? And I think you're right that doubt nourishes. Well, actually, it's doubt in both cases, isn't it? Wouldn't you say that? Just talk about that. I'm curious.
I think there is. That's a very good question. And what pulls? Maybe that's the same question. You know, in some ways, this a different way. Yeah. It's a good question. I don't know what I'd say to that. I mean, what pulls us in one direction or the other? I think it's not clear to me that that's going to be an intellectual assent. I mean, I think of that more as a therapeutic assent of sorts. And so it's hard, you know what I mean? So it's hard to answer, but you're definitely right. I mean, I definitely, in rehabilitating the role of doubt, I definitely don't want to lead to an anodyne version of doubt, you know, sort of a Disney doubt, where doubt now can play, you know, can do no wrong. So
I'm painfully aware of the second version that you've called the anodyne version, because it seems to me, I'll pick up on the romantic analogy you've already introduced. It seems to me that the second fatalistic version of this doubt is at the heart of romantic comedies, because I tell students in Love and Friendship in the summer, I teach this class in the summer, that you can lay romantic comedies end to end to end to end, because what do you always start with is, it's usually focused on the female character. She's in a relationship already and realizes this jerk that she's committed to is in fact a jerk. And we all know, it's amazing, we know from the first, usually in any romantic comedy, we the viewers know from the first 5 to 10 minutes that there's no way she belongs with the jerk she's found to spend her life with. But then, so we know, we can see where the narrative is going to go, but you lay that end to end with the next romantic comedy and the next one and the next one and the next one and the next one, and you get exactly this fatalistic doubt that I screwed up again. This guy wasn't the right one either. Let me try one more time. Oops, no, this guy isn't the right one either.
Well, and I think, I mean, this is to go, you know, you might say that, and I'm just trying to think of how to integrate this. certain kind of mistake, thinking obviously in the relational context that it's the person that matters, that love is something that you find or that happens to you rather than something that you do. And so you can think, you can think, it's kind of as though, the love one is supposed to have with one's partner is, it's kind of out there, and it's your ability to connect with it. That is the problem. And I think something, and that maybe it pulls us toward, maybe another way of thinking about this is it pulls us toward the more substantive notion of agnosticism. That ultimately we're in a predicament where we are worshiping the highest, and we can say very little else. I know that's if you're going to be and so you might think that that's another way of thinking about the mistake that the serial person makes is no different than the person that just kind of, goes from one religion to the next, to the next, to the next. I'm not saying that,
Right.
it would be a similar concern, therapeutic concern, I suppose. So I don't know if that's clear or not. It's still have to think that through. There are questions about that. Brent?
I'm formulating right now, but I'm curious with the relationship example, but what would you say is the safeguard to not necessarily indifference, but rather despair? I think despair to be different than indifference, because there's still a relationship of concern here, but it's not necessarily like throwing up of hands that I'll never know. It's being bothered by the fact that I couldn't possibly know. So how does despair?
And why do you see that as a context of despair?
Well, this is what I wonder about the question of skepticism. If we're talking purely epistemically here, what's the teleology involved here? What exactly are we aiming at between the two senses of agnosticism, substantial, or the other? I have this level of commitment to finding something, but what am I basing the inquiry on? Do I have a kind of end goal that I need to shoot for here?
Right. There's a set. I drew the analogy to the to the science example, looking for the black cat in the dark room.
Yeah.
And so, what's fascinating was, you might. So maybe here's where the science can help us a bit, right? It's not as though the scientists around the table said, "Oh God, yes, that's right," right? It was. That's right. That's exactly what it's like. So I think once again I think these sort of splits are sort of different, because I think it's the unknown of the world that draws. We often like to think the science science is just a series of facts that just kind of discover more. You just get to know more. The professor as an image in the science professor like on Gilligan's Island or anywhere else. Sort of the know-it-all, as it were, right? You might say, but that's precisely to get the doubt role wrong in science. People are pushed by the unknown. And I think, I can't help but think that there is a spiritual practice there as well. That's not one of despair, but one that, but I don't know, someone could despair and think, wow, I've got, the problem with, you might say the disanalogy, right, between the partner and God is, right? You see them all out there, right? And God is just kind of like, I don't even know whether there's anything there. I may be, praying to nothing, right? I take it that's the despair.
Yeah.
It's not just, oh, should I maybe have been Baha'i?
Right.
It's, or would I be better off if I were to, convert to Judaism or something? But it's rather, maybe it's just nothing, right? I take it I think that's the situation we're in. And I think that's inescapable, right? So you're right, it can be despair. I don't know if that can help.
Yeah, at what point do you double down? I take it in your situation with the romantic comedies, there's a kind of double down. I think of a show like Sex and the City. There's the tendency to double down in each of the relationships. I'm just going to keep doing that, but why? Why double down? Why double down? I'm still formulating this, and you probably did this in the sense of they're making the same mistake again and again. But Yeah, I'll leave it at that.
Yeah. And it's hard, I mean, and this is where I think it's interesting, because I mean, you can do all the philosophy of, the epistemic conditions and all this, but I think in the end, it's going to be really difficult to talk about doubt without talking about it in existential terms.
Yeah.
And then it's very, very easy to lose your hands on it. Yeah.
In your taxonomy, is there a difference between doubt and skepticism? When you talk about it, you almost sound like they're interchangeable. I don't think they are.
Yeah, I mean, skepticism is going to be, skepticism is a much more comprehensive, almost worldview of sorts. So you go back to Pyrrho, I mean, it's a very, it is itself an ethos of sorts.
Yes.
And it's hard to see how doubt could itself be an ethos. Even for Socrates, in a sense, it's a kind of an ethos. So I think there is a difference, and so I'm really focusing here on the smaller thing of doubt.
And then the last philosophy of religion course I taught, they read Hume.
Right, that's right.
And one of my colleagues said, why are they reading Hume? That's because Hume is a skeptic, and he's the best teacher. Well, not Hume necessarily, but a skeptic is the best teacher, I think, of faith. There it is.
Well, and in his wonderful dialogues concerning natural religion, you have a skeptic together with someone that represents a fairly orthodox position. And I think Hume is really alive to these very issues. And I think the ending of, the dialogue, brings that out quite clearly. Yeah, you got a question?
Well, me?
Yeah.
Yeah, I've been thinking about faith and belief, and it's hard to understand the difference and the similarities and what's going on. And the idea of doubt, I don't think you can have faith without doubt.
That's right.
You just can't do it. If you don't have doubt, you have a belief, and a belief. Most people who believe things are usually wrong.
That's right. And that's why, and that's why faith is, going back to the 1 Corinthians 13 passage that Augustine and Thomas, commented on. It is it's a feature of our world. I mean, it's a feature of this fallen world of relating to God.
I had a discussion years ago with another engineer, and we were talking about how much faith you had to have to be an engineer. And I claimed you had to have a lot of faith to be an engineer, and he didn't understand that. And I think you do have to have a lot of faith.
Yeah, Mark?
In the Kierkegaard class that I just finished today with Dr. Armitage, we were kind of earlier looking at the concept of, or his description of Abraham and concepts of doubt. And Kierkegaard seems to make the argument that if you ever doubt the question of faith, it is always a sin. And Dr. Armitage, Dr. Calhoun, and I got in a kind of a heated argument about whether the agony in the garden shows that there is any doubting in Christ, and saying that if there is another possibility, please let this pass from me. Can you kind of shed light on, is there a degree of doubt that is healthy, or is it always sinful, or are there different kinds of doubt, or?
And my argument here has been that no, it's not sinful at all, but that it's an inevitable part of a life of faith in a world of sin.
So then would you also say that it would be impossible for Christ to doubt? I remember you wrote the quote earlier that says it's impossible for him to have faith because...
If it's impossible for Christ to have faith, then it would be impossible for him to doubt in that sense. And so it's not clear what, obviously the take this cup from me, metaphor isn't a doubt in the sense of, it's closer to an act of potential rebellion than it is an act of potential doubt. And I think, because he's not.
It's not an epistemic uncertainty.
Yeah, it's really not an epistemic uncertainty. It's a take this cup from me. I mean, that's, yeah, Mark.
Oh,
Yeah, Mark. Yeah. I thought maybe you had something.
Sure.
Yeah.
No, I'm sorry
Okay.
for a question.
Anyway, does that help, Mark, or not? I don't know. I'm dizzily trying to scurry away from the controversy.
Taking sides.
Yeah, Mark, if you know.
Yeah, I wonder if you make a distinction between the basis of doubt in the ancient world, in say Judaic conception as you covered it, and the basis of doubt for a person of faith in a modern world. I mean, we don't want to say that in the Judaic example, in one sense, it's timeless, but in another sense, it's it's times because it's based on a non-empirical, conceptual basis of, our humility and lack of ability to know things.
Right.
But it seems like modern doubt, post-scientific revolution doubt for people of faith has a different basis. Don't you think?
I think it has a different basis. I think it has a different character.
Right.
I think it may be less a fear of being wrong, because I think it's more of a psychological account of what being wrong is, rather than sort of, think about Rorty's complaints about the way in which the version of doubt that I've given relies on this model of a mirror of nature, that we are, looking at it from an outside perspective. I think, maybe that's more of a postmodern doubt, but I think a modern doubt is very, very different. I think that's right. I mean, descriptively, it's right. I think then another question would be, what implications would that have for a person of faith?
Yeah, would you go further than to say that for a modern person of faith in a first world culture, the problem with doubt is complicated because that person takes on epistemic and evidentiary criteria from other domains that in the ancient world they might not. You take on evidentiary criteria from the domain of science, for example. Now I have to rationalize this with my belief. That's just not something that an ancient Jew would have been thinking about.
Right, that's right. Yeah, I think that difference is there. I don't know if there's, I think that's a good observation.
My students are very reductionistic in terms of their doubt. Many of them have been so taught by their science teacher that this is the only way it can be, and so as a consequence, they find it difficult to expand their ability aesthetically to see what one sort of very simple segment to. Maybe that's one of the differences between ancient skepticism and modern skepticism.
Right. You might call it a cosmopolitan doubt.
Yes,
Right. Yeah.
Cosmopolitan doubt, I like that.
I like it.
Very good. Well, I know in terms of time, I didn't know.
What's that?
Or, I don't know.
We
how
still
long-
have 10 minutes
Okay.
or so. To bring Michael's analysis of the poem here, this reminds me, actually, when you brought up original sin, that's not something that Hopkins brings to the surface. I mean, it's there, it's lying under the surface, it seems to me. But when you juxtapose, especially original sin, with the idea of nature's revealing God, it reminds me immediately of what may be kind of a proof text in natural theology. That's Romans chapter 1, where Paul says, all that may be known of God is revealed in the things that he has made. But what's fascinating about that passage, well, there's a lot of things, but there are a lot of things fascinating. But one thing that's fascinating in the light of your reading of the poem is St. Paul immediately juxtaposes the idea that nature reveals God with the idea of sinfulness obscuring the revelation of God in nature. Now, there's a history that's really interesting here. In the Catholic tradition, the emphasis tends to be placed on the first of those 2 points in tension, the idea of natural theology as possible. Starting with Luther, very clearly, the emphasis is placed on human sinfulness, obscuring to the point of not obliterating completely, but at least severely compromising how God is able to be revealed in nature. And so that really powerfully captures for me why you might think that doubt and faith are in a kind of dialectical relationship, because of course here natural theology could be taken as representative of all forms of philosophical theism, where you're trying to, like you've talked about before, evidentiary approaches. So I guess I would say, Mark, I'm not sure that that idea of an evidentiary approach, which we associate with science, is a new one. I mean, there's a long history, and it's certainly true that the successes of science alter the way we think about that evidentiary element. But right there in St. Paul, we have this picture that we have reason to doubt the deliverances of the project of natural theology because we are deeply screwed up. I'm curious what...
That's a technical term.
Yes, it is. Mike, I mean, what do you think about that in the light of the poem and Hopkins' approach to the idea of seeing God in nature?
I think he's he's always very intensely focused on the thing he's trying to describe and its individual qualities. And there's a certain, as a poet, a certain almost scientific quality to when he describes something. And the Windhover is a great one, where he describes the flight of a falcon as becoming an image of God, of Christ. Oh, my Chevrolet. But he's talking very specifically about its movements and how it rides the wind, and it's a very technical discussion. But in that, he sees a larger pattern. But for him, I think it's that divine spark and inside of us that allows us to connect with. But he sees that as being bleared and smeared and,
Right.
and imperfect, because we're now imperfect. And so I don't think I guess my thought on him is that he would never think that we could get to a perfect understanding. And his images for serious doubt, his dark nights of the soul, are always darkness and being awake at night and not being able to see what's beautiful in the world anymore.
Yeah, and I think, similar, if you think about other poets that do, move in a similar direction, I'm thinking here even of like Elizabeth Bishop's readings of Darwin. Darwin had, similar in his autobiography, similar worries even about his own, about his own ability to appreciate poetry and so on. And I think one of the things that could be brought out of that would be there's something about the poetic response which is clearly about the immersion of God in the world, or the immanence of God in the world, rather than focusing on God as transcendent. And I think it's not that God isn't transcendent,
Right.
but it's that.
Right.
And so I think there is this notion that if the world is fallen, the alternative must be the upward gaze. And I think the poetic response through Hopkins and through others is that despite the sinfulness in the world, you find God immanently. You find God, and not just in the totality, sort of a Spinoza, sort of panentheist
Right.
picture. But I always see in Hopkins and the other poets, and the artistic temperament in general is toward the singular. It's toward this notion of the immersion of God.
Or the modernists, we might say, if we take Eliot at the Volta there in the turn, this just turns into the wasteland without faith.
Yeah.
That you're moving into the desert and just the rattling of old bones and a dead world. And so without, I think in this poem, without that faith, it becomes a modernist poem and moves away from that more romantic, and in this case, religiously romantic poem.
And so doubt may look different, I think, if we view it in terms of the immanent rather than the transcendent. And I think we generally think about doubt as doubt about the transcendent.
Right.
Doubt about the origin of the origin of the universe. Why is there something rather than nothing? And I think one of the things that I do think poetry kind of pulls us toward is this notion of what does doubt look like if it's an encounter with the immersive God.
Well, that brings us back then to this existential option, because in a way you can read Hopkins then as inviting us to see what's there. And there is, in a sense, a choice. You can, like Hopkins, say, yes, it's there, or like Eliot, you can say, I'm not so sure it's there, right?
Maybe like Whitman or Emerson, I think he sees the poet's job as to not to say you can see it, but I can show it to you.
Right, to reveal it even, right.
Isn't that what the last line of the second, the first group means basically, is bearing out, speaking to the soil? But he's also saying you could probably interface with it if you walk with bare feet.
Yeah.
That's imminence.
Yeah, question.
Yeah, just kind of like going around, but kind of German theology, especially when it comes to like Schleiermacher, kind of like this new cross of liberalism. Essentially, kind of going along with this, is that it moves toward this relativistic faith, kind of like, which kind of goes towards agnosticism, and he kind of accepts that. He's like, well, Christianity can kind of work with this. Christianity actually can adopt this agnosticism, and we can promote this like inner self uniting, this immersion, because everything we do essentially is in a sense supernatural if we allow it to be. Kind of going in that sense, like, where does orthodoxy actually play into what is the radical claims like that Orthodox faith actually makes when it comes to, and you even see this come up in a lot of poetry, even like Robert Browning, when he's actually doing Bishop Logram's apology, he's actually talking about how like, the Catholicism or Orthodox faith is beautiful because faith allows doubt to strengthen faith, whereas if you're living this life of doubt, your moments of faith actually make, like, essentially shape your being, because moments of faith will radically change you. And so then there's people who go like Schleiermacher, who's like, well, every act can be an act of faith. And then there's this Orthodox movement which says that faith can only be rooted in the act of God and what God does on you and in this world. So I think more of my question is how does the Orthodox faith and like essentially dealt with that radically contradict, especially in our world of relativism, like how do we even approach that in this world?
Yeah, that's a good question, and I honestly do not know the answer. I mean, I just don't know enough about Orthodoxy to know how it's situated, but the suggestion that it makes is similar to the one that's come up multiple times now. I mean, there's a sense in which it's the symmetry argument of the symmetry argument. In other words, you know, what agnosticism looks like, or what doubt looks like, is going to play a very different role in the economy of different faiths. And I think I just don't know enough about Orthodox faith to know what the rehabilitation project would look like, or indeed whether a rehabilitation project's even necessary. I think I'm really, speaking out of a particular tradition in which I've seen it, disparaged in a certain way. So I just don't know. Maybe somebody here knows more about Orthodoxy.
Peter, you're talking about Orthodoxy in the generic sense, aren't you, rather than, yeah.
Oh, I was thinking
Yeah.
Orthodox faith. Yeah, and once again, I don't know. If anybody else knows. Our own discussion. I just don't know.
I wouldn't declare myself as knowing, but in terms of the Orthodox faith, which I know very
Yeah.
well, I look at the Seventh Ecumenical Council, the Second Council of Nicaea, for the answers.
Yeah.
That's what I look.
But it's a good question. And once again, I mean, Schleiermacher is obviously coming out of this very romantic tradition, so that would help with that as well. I wish I could help you more. It's just not enough.
Well, we are out of time now. Let's thank our speakers.